Hi, it's Dennis Daly. They say America is a nation of immigrants, and a wonderful author named Jean Shinto may have written the definitive book on Americans who are of immigrant descent. She focused in on Lawrence, Massachusetts in a book called Huddle Fever. I asked her why she picked Lawrence.
It was involuntary because I moved there because of my husband's job. I moved there from Washington, D.C., a major city, obviously, and I'd never lived in an industrial city before, or let's call it a deindustrialized city these days. And I looked around and saw all these old brick factories and these tenements, and I'd never quite understood how cities grow this way. Washington, a planned city, and really, even with all its problems, a city that works fairly well. But here was Lawrence, and it wasn't working well at all, and I just kept asking the question, why? How did somebody let it get this way?
When did the first, maybe not the first wave of immigrants, take us back, if you will, and put it into historical perspective, where Lawrence is in Massachusetts, geographically, and when it was first settled and by whom?
Lawrence is about 25 miles north of Boston, close to the New Hampshire border, so picture it between Boston and the New Hampshire border. And in 1845, some Boston businessmen who had made a lot of money in Lowell, about 10 miles south on the Merrimack River, in textiles, decided they'd do it again in Lawrence, only bigger. And so they dammed the river up there and built the city literally overnight. And luckily for some, and not so luckily for others, the Irish famine had just occurred, and they came and worked first, and building the mills, in fact, and the dam. And then later, subsequent immigrant groups came. The men did get rich, but the immigrants suffered in a lot of ways.
In many ways, it sounds like a Western boomtown.
Oh, yes.
You hear of places like Gillette, Wyoming, which overnight they strike silver or gold or something, and the next thing you know, there's a town there.
Yeah, so many of those early newspaper clippings really have that aura. The dust, in fact, from the construction gives it that Western feeling, too. And there was the saloon atmosphere and lots of men rather than families coming, to work.
Historically, I guess we also need to explain why the river was so important in an era, obviously, before electricity. I mean, all the historic textile mills had to be on some source of power like that.
Yes, we forget, but I call it geography is destiny for some of these places because of those rivers. Those industrial cities dot these rivers. The water power moved those turbines and the belts and the gears and made the machines go. Later steam came in, and then electricity, of course.
Maybe this is a naive question, but how was the message of America spread? How did these people in Ireland, and you said that was coincidentally where a lot of people were being displaced, how did they suddenly find out that there was gold, streets paved with gold and opportunities on this side of the Atlantic?
Well, immigrants often have these important networks between one another. There are rumors that the mill owners put out posters in Italy, for example, showing people running from the mills with great bags of money. But this is sort of a myth, and no poster has ever been found like that. They've only been described. But I think that it was just that immigrant network, families communicating, letters, people going back and forth, too. We have to remember.
People over in Europe got the message that there were jobs in the U.S. I guess communications, of course, was possible in the early part of the 1800s. There were boats going back and forth, no satellites, no overseas telegraph, but yet the message got out, albeit a lot slower than today.
Yes, certainly. And everything, you're right, everything was slower, but it's also interesting to remember that Lawrence and those industrial cities were responsible for the speeding up of the world, too, because those machines started things going faster and faster. In Lowell, for example, when cloth was first made by the assembly line, things were a little more genteel. The Lowell mill girls made that cloth. In Lawrence, they were going to do it bigger and faster and better, and that wore people down. The machines were bigger. They brought men in, and everything changed. Children, too, unfortunately, started to work there in Lawrence.
Was there a skewed concept of community then because of the overwhelming number of men, or does that enter into this at all?
Well, it does a bit, because men came and they lived in communal boarding houses. I think the family situations were strange. We in our family values way think, oh, this golden age of family, but in Lawrence it was different. Women, of course, worked, and that was common. One of the first daycare centers was in Lawrence, Massachusetts, run by the Venerini sisters. They brought them over from Italy because the parents worked. It was 1905 or 1906 or 7. They were brought over by the church so that both parents could work.
Yeah, I get the impression you mentioned Lowell several times, which is Ed McMahon's hometown.
Oh, really?
And I was talking to him on this program a couple of years ago, and he was describing an interesting kind of Currier and Ives city. Oh. We were talking about wintertime in the interview, but the fact that I sensed that there was a little bit more gentility, maybe, or at least Irish Catholic family there in Lowell than in Lawrence.
Well, it was even more farther back than that, not necessarily even Irish Catholic, but we'll call them American, for lack of a better term, but these were farm girls that they brought from New England, Maine, and New Hampshire, and it was supposed to be just a brief stint. They would work there 4 years and then go back, because nobody would ever want to work in a factory for life, would they? It would just be so awful, and we never would want to happen in the United States what happened in England, that Dickensian situation there. So here we would do it differently. Of course, greed took over.
How awful was it? We just passed an anniversary about 3-4 weeks ago, not to totally digress here, of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York City. And the reason I bring that up is nearly 200 workers died in a cramped loft in New York City for a very strange reason, very tragic reason. Management knew where the other stairwells were. Labor didn't. The employees had to pass through a very narrow hallway, single file, that was set up to keep them from sneaking anything out of the building. So all of the things that the ownership had put up as structure to regulate the employees served to be their doom. Yes. When it was all over. How much of that caste system, if you will, and that's the way I look at it, was present in the management of the early 1800s in factories then? What were conditions like?
Yes, in the early 1900s. Well, in 1860 or 61, I forget which, there was the Pemberton Mill collapse in Lawrence. That was also due to the fact that they had wanted to build things bigger in Lawrence. They brought in machines that were too big for the floors to sustain them. They had made the windows bigger because the building was bigger and they needed more light. So 5 stories went down. That was unusual, though. I think one of the most difficult things about working in a mill in, say, 1900 was the noise. And if you go to Lowell, in fact, now they have a working weave room where you can walk in and experience that awful noise that people experienced 12 hours a day, often enough. And they give you earplugs as you walk in because it's just such a din which vibrates your entire body. Your ears are a minor part of it. Your fingernails seem to be vibrating too with this noise. You had to stand, of course, and that was one of the hierarchical things where you, if you had a good job in the mill, you had a sit-down job. It was also very dirty. They just brought all this wool and cotton straight, raw, into the factories and washed it, and washing it over and over again, and the greasy steam would come up.
Boy, no EPA, no OSHA.
No, not a bit.
Was there any regulation? Was there ever an effort of any local citizenry to say, hey, this is just not right?
Well, sometimes, but it's also cut by this, that everyone was so happy to get a job, too. It was work, full employment, and we have to remember how advanced, really, we are now.
But we still hear that. I mean, if there's any phrase I'm personally tired of hearing, it's shut up, be happy you've got a job.
Yes, it is. It's true. I realize that, and yet it's a reality. That's a hard one.
Well, I don't want to admit that, though.
Is no job better than a bad job? Yes.
I tell students it is.
Yes.
I tell students, as particularly, do you remember the movie Metropolis? You're too young to.
No, I do remember that.
1926?
Oh, no, I know. I'm thinking of Metropolitan.
Okay, Metropolis was done in Germany by a fellow named Fritz Lang. It's a silent film.
Uh-huh.
2 reels are missing. and in it, he shows a huge machine with an endless line of workers walking into it, and you begin to realize it's a mouth that's chewing these workers up. I mean, tremendous metaphor for that. But
yes.
I occasionally guest teach at colleges, and I tell students, I say, now, I know you have to eat, and I know you have to make a car payment, but it's better to starve than to have an abusive boss.
You may be right, and you have to also think of Lawrence and Lowell in the North in this way. They called them the Lords of the Loom, and they called the people in the South the Lords of the, what's the opposite? Of the lash. So that these slaves were, yes, growing cotton, and it was going up to the supposed abolitionist North. And yet, there was a direct line. Emerson calls it, in fact, a thread of cotton links them both.
We have been talking about the immigrant experience, the people who moved to Lawrence, Massachusetts. You skirted on something that makes me think of the Civil War here, suddenly. I would presume with the need for uniforms.
Oh.
What then happened in the industrial North? And I'm just full of digressions today. One of the great lines in Ken Burns' Civil War documentary was that so few people in the North knew the Civil War was going on, they still had the Harvard-Yale yacht races during those 2 summers when, a third of all the men in Alabama were either died or wounded in some situation. What about the industrial North then when the Civil War happened? How important was that region to keeping the war effort going?
You mean in terms of soldiers?
Well, not only soldiers, but just uniforms, cloth.
Each war was a boon for Lawrence. Civil War, World War I especially, that was, I think, the peak. Lawrence and the other industrial cities that made textiles in those years are said to have declined in the 50s when those mills moved south. But actually, the decline started right after World War I and went and continued until there was another little blip for World War II. And then another very small one for Korea, and then that was the end. But Teddy Roosevelt changed the Army uniform from blue to olive for the right before World War I, and that was really how Lawrence made its biggest bucks. So it is connected so much with war.
What was your biggest surprise in researching the immigrant influx and all of the things that happened? The title of the book, Huddle Fever, is very interesting. I have been in a lot of discussions with friends about what is called here in the generic sense the ghetto mentality. When you bring a lot of people of similar kind together in a situation, in many ways they tend to reinforce that aspect about them which is the most different, which is why the Poles in Chicago have more festivals than they do in Warsaw. But what did you find out in looking at that compact coming together of immigrant groups as far as the abuse they suffered, but also the support they had among themselves?
Yes, they did. And my huddle fever term is somewhat pejorative, but I should soften it a bit. The huddle fever is a threefold meaning. One, of course, taken from the Emma Lazarus poem. The second from the huddled buildings. Huddling people together is a disease, they say, in one of these 1911 surveys of reformers who saw that the buildings were so close together. But then the huddle fever that makes people have a cloying sort of closeness when they've come so far and it's so scary out there, and they do tend to stay together, do things only the way people have done them before, this kind of regimentation that is so secure. And yet I feel that is a support group, and maybe I should have made more of it, that that sense of security that it gave for so many, and was so important because of grandmothers who never did learn to speak English. Someone was just telling me the other day, in fact, I know what you mean by huddle fever. One of my best students was accepted at both a small law school in Boston, Suffolk, and Stanford Law School. He stayed and went to law school in Suffolk because his mother was there, widowed, and he had to support her. Well, you think, oh, the fool in our American way, why not go to the better school? But you should also realize what an altruistic guy to do this.
Jean Shinto, she is an author of many books, a very popular one on sports, but we're talking about a book she's written called Huddle Fever, talking about the immigrant experience, how we all huddled together in small groups when we came here and were the only Polish people in the city, or the only blacks or Puerto Ricans, or in my case, the only Irish. Jean, early on I mentioned Jasper, Indiana. My dad was a plumbing and heating contractor, and we lived very near Jasper, and anytime he would go to Jasper, he had a very good friend there, an older fellow named Joe Bleemel, who I could go on for hours and tell you about. I ought to write a book about him. But he would call up Joe Bleemel and say, "Do I need to bring you with me?" And the reason was, if he had to dicker with too old a family, their English skills, now this is in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, their ability to understand the semantics of doing business, if they still spoke mostly German at home, my dad couldn't crack the code. So he had to bring Joe Bleemel with him, who was a German-American and could speak both. So we still have that in the United States. And the other thing to remember is that Lawrence Welk was born in this country. I mean, that is
astounding.
What about the role of the church or churches in those immigrant communities?
Yes, the churches were essential in a lot of ways, and I am hard on them in the book. I'm probably criticized a bit more for that than anything else. Each group, of course, we're talking Catholicism here. Each group had its own parish. They were kept separate, I guess because that's the way they felt that it should be, the church and the neighborhoods too.
Well, and the other thing too is that we were dealing, and this may be difficult to explain to Protestants, until the use of English in the Mass. Everything was in Latin, but to me, that uniformity then begged for some differentiation if the parish itself were different. My hometown, 10,000 people, 2 Catholic churches. I still can remember one being referred to as the Irish Church and one as the German Church.
Oh, yes.
But today, they because of the downsizing, if you will, of the church, they're both in the same diocese and they share priests and everything. But there was a differentiation between them up until probably World War II or so.
Well, it was very much a social organ, too, and you were assumed that there would be weddings, and who would those weddings be for? They'd be for the same ethnic groups. In Lawrence, you can quip that a mixed marriage was one between a Neapolitan and a Sicilian, because that's how it was, and you didn't venture into the other neighborhoods. You had your own bakery, your own newspaper. The church did other things, too, though. The strike, the Bread and Roses strike of 1912 was a landmark in a lot of ways. And the church was really on the mill owners' side at that point, and they were, I think, considered, and I consider them to be the helpful strike breakers.
You know, we're seeing that in Mexico now.
Oh,
that
yes.
If you look at the Catholic Church in Mexico, traditionally you would think that it would be on the side of the peasants. But the Pope's recent statement about taking priests out of the political process and making them less militant in their actions tends to align them now with the wealthy landowners. And it's gone terribly full circle.
Haywire.
Maybe in a passive sort of way, but that's the result of it now.
Yes. What did the church get out of it? Well, I don't know. A lot of that is just speculation, but it's clear that 50 years after that strike, there was a big celebration, not of the strike itself in Lawrence, but of the strike breaking. For God and Country was the name of that parade that they had in '62.
What is Lawrence like today?
Well, people who don't go there regularly have an opinion of it that I think I have, that I differ with. I lived there for 10 years, and yes, it's depressed. There's no question about it, especially because those tenements built for the immigrants are old now. They weren't built to last in the first place, and they're decaying, and they do catch fire easily. They're made of soft woods. So you see this infrastructure, to use an awful word, that is alarming and depressing. Here in Washington, D.C., where we're speaking from, everything is made of brick. So even if there's poverty, it's not this kind of wooden matchstick sort of situation.
Yeah, and you don't see it from the outside. The insides of those federal townhouses here in Washington may be falling apart, but if they're kept up, they still look okay on the outside.
Yes.
It's a very sturdy look. I think also a lot of people who have lived most of their lives, particularly in the West, which is a younger part of America. Yeah. For example, I did a show from Flagstaff, Arizona about a year ago, and they showed me a photograph taken from a place I was standing of only 2 buildings with a pine forest behind it, and that was Flagstaff. The city is so new, its entire life is photographed.
Wow.
And you can stand in the same place and see the whole city, but there just used to be one intersection, and that was Flagstaff. But the point I'm making is a lot of people are only used to seeing sturdy buildings or new buildings. They need to take the Amtrak from here to Boston through 300 miles of warehouses that are closed and rusted and machinery falling down. It's depressing.
Yes.
I mean, it really is.
It can be. And along with all these falling down wooden tenements, you still have those huge brick, extremely well-made factories. So it's really an irony, huddling people together. Yes, it is a shame, but hey, let's remember we have these great big factories, many of them empty, of course, now, still in good use, but there's a problem because of the narrow streets, not made for cars. The whole place has to be rethought. It's a beautiful place in a lot of ways, but it needs a new vision, and that's another one of the problems with, I suppose, just doing things the way you've always done them, in the huddle fever way. A city has the disease, too, as much as an individual.
It looks at the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, a compact, grungy, overworked community, and the textile industry was the lifeblood of it for many years. Now it is ethnically changing. My special guest is the author of the book, Gene Shinto. Gene, you know, some of the descriptions you've given in the book in a way remind me of that claustrophobic, gritty kind of description of London in the time of Charles Dickens.
It is, but let's remember now, let's go to 95 and 96 and the new injection of the Latinos and the new culture. It's vibrant, it's colorful, it is not a myth. And that overlaying the brick is really astounding. In one of the interviews I did for the book, I met a young artist, a painter from the Dominican Republic. And if you think of painters from Lawrence, you think, oh, they must be painting these brick mills. But there was not a brick in sight in her paintings. They may as well have been of the Caribbean, with colors and people that you don't associate with the old Dickensian Lawrence.
Was there or is there a sense in that area of any type of resentment because of ethnic change? In some cases, the original ethnic texture of a city has more or less died, or in a neighborhood, before a new group comes in. But sometimes a lot of people are on the cusp, particularly older people. We see that in West Hollywood, for example, which has a very large gay and lesbian community living in the midst of an Orthodox Jewish community, which still lives there. And there's this incredible intermingling, but it didn't happen easily.
Yes.
Is there a remnant of resentment there now?
Yes, it's not just a remnant either. That's pretty clearly a difficulty there. Many of the older mill workers or children of mill workers are there, and they see their city decaying, and then they see newcomers arriving, and they put the two together erroneously. It's also true that they did have these jobs, which we denigrate, but they did have jobs. And many of the new immigrants don't. They don't necessarily come to Lawrence to work because they're at 16% unemployment. There is difficulty. There is, we call it the immigrant city, but between 1924 and 65, nobody came in. We didn't even have an exodus of blacks coming up north because there weren't any jobs for them during that time. So you have to think of it as a very stagnant place that was called the immigrant city. And then this new influx, and where did these people come from and why did they choose us? Well, they chose them because of the cheap housing and other reasons too.
Yeah, and if the city were that static during the middle part of the century, that means that group in its 70s and 80s now feels incredibly comfortable with what was a long status quo there, that they're seeing change very rapidly, at least in their time continuum.
Yes. When we arrived in 84, it looked like a city from the 50s that had been urban renewed, but there was so much still from the past there. And then there was incredible change between 84 and 94. A massive influx and also a huge birth rate. And they did almost overnight see such a difference. And we can't forget the racial makeup. It was a very white ethnic mix, the Irish, Italians, French Canadians. And now these new groups are not white, and they're not used to it. Boston, the Boston area, New England is not used to this change.
Was there integration among the white groups there, or did we always see a differentiation, an ethnic resentment between those as time progressed?
Well, I think there really was intermarriage. It couldn't help but happen, and it did. And I think that occurred. Irish married Italians, and the churches remained their particular churches. But I think that waned. It would be great if this too would pass. Interestingly, I think that because of racial tensions, perhaps something different will happen now. In the old days, people moved out of Lawrence when they got money and they went into the suburbs. And that's another reason why some of those people who have remained are resentful, because they feel somewhat failures. But these new groups perhaps won't be as welcomed in the suburbs. They'll stay in Lawrence, perhaps. And ironically, it will be a benefit to the city because they may stay with their money and make it grow instead of having it be sort of a way to a place that people pass through, another kind of Ellis Island almost.
Jean, what is the lesson here for people listening, regardless of what size town they're in, even if it's a rural community, as far as looking at how the city is changing, planning for the deterioration? I keep talking a lot about my hometown, but it has basically a 5-block-long Main Street, of which nearly every other block on every other side has been taken down. That rather than let those downtown buildings, when Penny's and Montgomery Ward moved out, decay, they've raised the entire block, put in parks and parking lot. So, I look at that as being, hey, one of these days we're going to have places to park for no store. But yet the city, unlike, I'll give you an example, Brownsville, Pennsylvania, the entire downtown is boarded up. What would you say to people who live in a community as far as taking stock and saying both geographically, in the infrastructure, in the history, just the texture of the city, to make sure that at least they know where they're going with it as it changes?
Yes, well, I don't recommend parking lots, but I think what I really wish, I wish that the surrounding communities wouldn't look upon these places as places to avoid. If anything, I would hope that, though we've talked about the realities, that the book and maybe this conversation would give people a reason to go to these places and look at them and see the history and see what could be there. No, you're not going to go shop there, perhaps, but you will go to look and maybe meet some new people. And the more people on the street, the safer these places are. I know that that crime is a concern. But if you've lived in a major city and you go to a small city like Lawrence, you see the difference, and it's not as fearful as you imagine.
What is the population of Lawrence? Or is it absorbed into the whole Boston metroplex? Can you separate it out?
Oh, sure. It's only 6 or 7 square miles. It's astoundingly small, and it's 60,000 people. At its peak, it was 100,000, say in 1910. But now it's 60,000, and...
That's a lot of people in a compact area.
Yes, I told you, huddled.
Yeah, now I better understand the title.
Yes, and in fact, don't forget the river takes up some space too, so it's really 4 square miles that everybody's squished into.
Jean, now that the book has come out, what do the people in Lawrence think about it?
People who have read it, I think, uniformly admire it, saying that I've got it right. And I especially hear and get letters from Laurentians out who've moved to Dallas, Phoenix, Rochester, New York, all over, San Francisco, and they are really pleased to have it, have their city discussed, too.
One other thing, and this is not the only book you've done, I compliment you. Who did the cover?
Oh, that's by Ralph Fasanella, an interesting New York artist in his 80s.
Wow.
He is sort of a Grandma Moses.
Yeah, I was going to say
it's
that primitive art, but it fits so well with the topic and everything.
He came for about a few years to Lawrence. He felt dry in New York. He was discovered, and he got a lot of media publicity, and he needed to get away. So he went to Lawrence. He had been an old labor organizer, and so this was a natural for him, and he spent a number of years living at the Y and painting Lawrence. I always envisioned his painting on the cover.
You also have done a book on sports heroes. We should do a show on that sometime.
Oh, yes, that's a great book. I'll send you a copy.
Quick quiz. You mentioned Huddled and Emma Lazarus's poem, which is on the base of the Statue of Liberty, The New Colossus. Do you know the third verse? I can always get, in the beginning, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gate. I don't know why she ever wrote that phrase. Shall stand a mighty woman with a torch. But the next one I can't do.
Oh, no.
And the last line of which is, and it's, you get misty-eyed. It's right before Give Me Your Tired, Your Poor. A lot of people don't know the last line of it is, and in her hand is the imprisoned lightning.
Oh.
Yeah.
I love it.
I found her original draft were. It's, I'm trying to remember. It is, O metal mother with the lamp, you hold it up so strong and bold. If you must stay out for the night, please wear a coat or you'll catch cold.
Well, I thought you were going to ask me about the, I can't remember exactly how it goes, but
I need to look it up because I don't know. I'm missing a piece of the poem out of the middle.
Well, have you heard of the recent controversy, though, where they quoted it without "You're wretched"?
No.
Because they wanted to, in these times of immigration legislation and new ideas about what we should do with immigrants, they decided to eliminate that little bit, but I can't remember it exactly. You'll have to.
I guess in the Christmas Carol they'll have to take out for poor ornery people like you and like I, meaning ordinary.
Yes.
Jean Shinto, thank you very much. The book is called Huddle Fever. We've talked around it and through it, and I hope we got the salient points of it. It's a wonderful book, and it's a topic I think we think about too little, and that's how we all got here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Mostly because of Jean Shinto's book, the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts has embraced the fact that it was an early city of immigrants. I'm Dennis Daly.